Public Interest. I am Malika Ramsey. Thank you very much for joining us again this week. On this week's program, we focus on the National Insurance Scheme, NIS. Of course, as you know, most of our workers, it's not only about senior citizens, but most of our workers depend on the National Insurance Scheme for whatever benefits they may require. Of course, to talk more about that with me is leader of the People's National Congress Reform and leader of the opposition, Brigadier the Honorable David Granger. Welcome back, sir.
Thank you, Mike.
First off, sir, we noticed that this week, yourself and the Partnership for National Unity, you are more or less calling on the current government, the PPPC government and administration, to what you call reform the National Insurance Scheme. Even before we talk about that call, from the reports, from the things that we're hearing, do you think that Guyanese should be concerned with what's happening, especially those who stand to benefit from the NIS? Or should they be concerned about what's happening?
Yes, we are all concerned. I think we're facing a catastrophe. We must take a step back and see what the NIS is all about and why it was established in the first place. In fact, in September, it was 44 years old. It was established in September 1969 by the People's National Congress administration. Again, we must understand the vision of Robert Burnham, who was Prime Minister at the time. And that is, he saw that the National Insurance Scheme would be able to provide a sort of safety net for persons who were old and couldn't be employed anymore, or they were disabled or pregnant, a variety of issues to make sure that people were able to live a comfortable life. In fact, Burnham had a vision of the citizen, a well-educated citizen. He felt that his welfare plan aimed at eradicating ignorance. That is, he introduced what he called free education from nursery to university. And the NIS was really a plan to look after the physical well-being of every citizen from cradle to the grave. So you can't separate the two. It was part of a whole vision to ensure that the Guyanese citizen had a good life. So when we speak about free education, we also speak about the National Insurance Scheme. So it was meant to protect citizens from want, from poverty, from being left without an income after they work. So anything that happened to that scheme, we are concerned about. And right now, the scheme is in crisis, and that is why we're worried. Yes, we all should be worried.
You did say that it was meant to be some sort of a safety net for people, to protect people. What has caused it not to be that safety net today? What has caused the, if you want to call it, deterioration of the NIS?
Well, the biggest problem is political heavy-handedness, political manipulation, political micromanagement of the scheme. And from the start of the People's Progressive Party civic administration in 1992, we saw the installation of Dr. Roger Luncheon as the chairman of the board. So there's no way that they can avoid responsibility for all of the decisions which have been taken to guide the National Insurance Scheme over the last 21 years or so. So he's been chairman of the board, and there are other PPP representatives on the board. So I think the first problem we have to face is the one of political micromanagement. The second one is that they made some bad choices, some bad investments. For example, they took money which should be invested for the benefit of the scheme, for the benefit of the contributors to the scheme, and invested in the Berbice Harbor Bridge, the Clico, and there are other investments, and nobody is quite sure that these investments have been profitable. The third thing is, of course, that over the years they've been receiving advice on how to reform the National Insurance Scheme, and that advice has not been followed. In fact, even if they did not get the advice, certain changes were taking place. As people become healthier, they live longer, and therefore they draw their pensions for a longer period of time. Now, if a person has been contributing to the scheme, and the person has sufficient contributions over the years, that person would be entitled to, for example, an old age pension from age 60. But if people live a very short time, maybe five or till they're 65, it means that they'll only draw a pension for a long time. But if people live a long time, like Nelson Mandela,
Yeah.
that means you'll be drawing pension for 35 years. So the healthier people are, the longer they live, the more money has to be expended to give them pension. Because once you become 60, you stop paying contribution and then you start receiving. That is how the insurance scheme works. You pay monthly contributions as an employee until you're 60, and after 60, you start receiving benefits. Now, what I'm saying here is that the people who manage the National Insurance Board, particularly the level of the chairman, had to be aware of the fact that people are living longer. Therefore, they would draw pension for a longer period of time. So those are the three main problems that affect the scheme that has brought it to a crisis stage. One is the biggest problem, I think, is political manipulation. The second problem is the ill-advised investment. And the third is the failure to reform.
I think one of the things that would raise the most red flags is this thing about mismanaging in terms of investment, taking monies from NIS to invest it into other projects. Now, my question is, Mr. Granger, is there anything in our constitution or in terms of the functioning of NIS that could have deemed this taking money from the NIS to invest in other companies, that could have deemed that process illegal?
No, I have not seen any illegality. I've seen incompetence. I've seen mismanagement. And I've seen maybe failure to take advice. But I haven't myself seen any evidence of illegality. What we know is that the board and the chairman of the board, of course, who's a politician, is a member of the PPP Central Committee, Dr. Lanshan. They may have been taking decisions which are of political interest to the PPP, and not in the general interest of the scheme itself. So I wouldn't say that it's illegal, but what I'm saying is partisan, and that is why APNU is calling for the establishment of a more independent board, an autonomous board that is not subject to political direction. But people can make decisions, or the manager and the chairman and the other officials on the board could make decisions in the interest of the financial sustainability of the entire scheme.
How would you suggest that maybe a national process to establish such a board, to make it independent from, if you want to say, political interference, meaning not have Dr. Luncheon as the chairman, but is there a specific process that APN would identify to say these are the group of people we want running and managing the national insurance scheme?
I don't want to personalize it, Dr. Luncheon. I know APNU is not against Dr. Luncheon as such. APNU is against the excessive politicization of the board, because as a result, the decisions we see being made seem to be designed to further the political interests of one party, that's PPP, and they're not in the public good. They're not in the public interest, as this program is called. So it is not a matter of Dr. Luncheon. I don't want to replace Dr. Luncheon with maybe Mr. Komal Chan or Gail Teixeira. I'm not making any allegations about his personal competence. What I'm talking about is politicization of the board. And what we need is a board that is committed, a business-like board, a professional board, which can take decisions which are more objective, which are more impersonal, and which commit the scheme to getting the best interest, the best result for the money, for the investment.
How do we get such a professional team?
Well, there are people in Guyana. There are successful business persons in Guyana. There are professional people in Guyana. And we're going through this process now in the National Assembly by looking for people for the Public Procurement Commission. It's a process that goes on all the time. We look for people who can become the ombudsman, or people can hold positions of integrity in the community. And I don't want to believe that they're not such persons. Our problem is that for most of the life of the National Insurance Scheme, there was no crisis of the proportion that we have today. it was only within the last few years that the board went into crisis in terms of it becoming a loss-making entity. It's actually now spending more than it's receiving. So what we're saying is that for a long time the board was properly managed, but things change and we need to ensure that the reforms are made so that, for example, the internal procedures are improved. We've got several thousand, I think there are about 43,000 pensioners alone, and there might be like 117,000 members of the scheme. Now, you need to computerize this information. You need to have a database with the information. You can't have a lot of papers and handwritten documents and typewritten documents, cards with that have to be typed in. All this stuff has to be computerized. Since the PNC was in office in 1989, the process of computerization started. Up to now, it's not finished after 24 years. So there is a level of mismanagement that the board has not been ensuring that there is a modernization plan in place. That is part of the problem.
All right. Apart from not politicizing or not getting it involved in politics, what would you say that the previous or the persons who created NIS, what would you say that they've done differently compared to what's happening now?
Well, it's a vision thing. I think the scheme has to be driven by a vision. It has to be. It has to aim at achieving a certain quality of life for the persons who contribute. And I think what is missing is that vision thing. That people in the People's Progressive Party came into office and discovered this, bundles of money, and they decided to use that money for various harebrained schemes. So they did not say, well, look, there are 100,000 people out there depending on these savings, depending on this fund. I must be very careful, I must be very prudent in how I invest these funds, because if I make, a rash decision, these people could be left without a safety net. A person who is 65 or 70 or 75 depends on the income that he or she gets every month as a sort of payback, if you can call it that. It's an entitlement, of course, from the National Insurance Scheme. But if the scheme is in jeopardy, that person's income will not be raised or will not be paid on time. And right now in Berbice, because you have many former cane harvesters, I think there are about 15,000 cane harvesters, many of them are on the scheme. And when they retire, they look forward to receiving their pension. Not a massive pension, but it is important to their survival. So if the scheme's fund is not prudently managed, it would jeopardize the livelihood of those persons. Because even the amount that they receive in 1 year may not be adequate in future years. Let's say a person gets $20,000 in 1990 or 2000. That person looks forward to a greater increment year by year to keep abreast of the cost of living. So the scheme has a commitment to continue to pay out a realistic pension. But that pension is only one part of the benefits. You have mothers, who are pregnant, who have to stay at home, they get benefits as well. Persons who are injured get benefits. Person who need maybe medication or medical attention get benefits. So the pension is not the only benefit. It is a very complex scheme that requires a tremendous inflow or collection of revenue, and because there is a tremendous expenditure. And once you have people who do not register or who do not collect, the scheme will be jeopardized. Another one of the problems facing the scheme, for example, is that there are some employers who actually collect money from their workers, because the contribution is made in two parts. One is the employee has to make a contribution, and second, the employer has to make a contribution, and the two contributions together constitute the income of the NIS. But some employers collect the money from their workers but do not pay it into the scheme. So Guyana Sugar Corporation alone, I believe, is indebted about $500 million. And there are other persons who, in fact, the workers don't discover this till they go to make a claim. They discover that their previous employer hadn't been paying it at all. So there is a lack of enforcement. In fact, those people who have actually taken money from the workers but not paid it into the scheme could be prosecuted.
Don't we need to take possibly, because you did say in some cases people owe millions for their workers. Is there something that we can do to speed up this process of prosecution?
Well, it is a matter for the board.
Okay.
And this is one of the faults of the board because, for example, as you know, the Guyana Sugar Corporation is a state-owned corporation. The chairman of the board is an employee of the state, and I can only assume that he has not been vigorously pursuing the collection of those funds.
All right. Brigadier, without trying to be negative or sound negative, I'm going to call it being realistic. Even though we don't want it to collapse, is there any possible alternative for workers if the NIS should collapse?
It's a hard question. This is a scheme that was set up 44 years ago, and I believe it's a good scheme. It's the only scheme that I'm aware of that caters for such a large number of workers. And my understanding is that there might be as many as 117,000 workers. I cannot imagine what would happen if the scheme collapsed. It would lead to a social catastrophe. A lot of Guyanese would be thrown on the breadline because even the small pensions that they get, for example, those who are getting old age benefits, is inadequate, and people have to continue working or they have to supplement their pension from other sources. There is no other scheme in Guyana that I know that has the capability to cater for such a large number of workers. Because, as I said, it's a multifaceted scheme. It's not just pensions. You also have pregnancy and sickness and disability and other benefits.
Now, the People's National Congress reform would have been calling for NIS to be reformed, not necessarily in these same words, but for it to be reformed for almost a decade. It seems that the calls have fallen on deaf ears. What makes you think that it will be different now for David Granger and the partnership with National Unity? Of course, PNC is also part of APNU. What's different now?
The crisis has worsened,
Okay.
and the scheme is now in an annual deficit. Other persons in civil society have started to write about the scheme critically. So I think that there is, I would say, a greater consciousness on the part of society, on the part of the entire country, consciousness about what is happening and a commitment to ensure that the scheme works more efficiently. So I would say that unfortunately the situation has gotten worse. Therefore, in a way, it has gotten better to enable us or to justify the action that APNU will take or has taken. We can probably go to the floor of the National Assembly and bring motions. Of course, we cannot actually intervene in the functioning of the board, but we feel we can raise our voices to ensure that the scheme doesn't collapse.
I'm happy that you did mention the National Assembly, because I'm just going to read one sentence out of APNU's call for NIS's reformation. The trustees of NIS funds must be accountable directly to the National Assembly and not to the PPPC administration. My question now is, how do you ensure that the trustees are accountable to the National Assembly? What role can APNU play in that?
It will call for a change in legislation. It is not something that we can do on our own, but we can start the process by initiating motions, calling for investigations, calling for reports. These reports are already presented to the National Assembly. But it's important for us to raise our voices and call for a change in the way the national insurance scheme is administered. I do feel confident that if the NIS had to report to the National Assembly, they would be a lot more cautious and a lot less cavalier than they are at present.
Were these monies not invested from NIS, not invested into other projects such as the Barbies River Bridge? Financially, do you think they would have been? This is aside from the other aspects of mismanaging and politicizing. Do you think that financially the NIS would have been in a better state today?
I do not know what the portfolio, the investment portfolio is, but it is my view that a scheme like the NIS needs to avoid risky investment, and I cannot decide exactly what is a prudent investment in the case of the NIS. There might be limitations here. Sometimes investments are made in Trinidad or in other countries, and the revenue is brought back to augment the fund in the NIS. So it is a matter of choice, and our argument is that some of the investments seem to have a political flavor, and they seem to be reckless. It is well known the problems that affected the CLICO. We understand that the NIS has actually bought a building in Paramaribo on behalf of the government. And there is no indication that the scheme has benefited, in terms of profit, in terms of revenue from the acquisition of that building. So the scheme has to make money other than through the contribution. The contributions will never be enough because people, depending on how long they live, the whole purpose of insurance is to convince contributors that they could derive more benefit than they actually pay. They could, gain more profit than if they did not invest. That is what, when you insure your car, if the car crashed, you can replace the car perhaps. And that is why people go into insurance. It's an insurance policy. So what we're looking for is more prudence. And wherever those investments are, sometimes they could be in treasury bills, sometimes it could be in other countries. We need to pursue those avenues.
You did say that NIS, it must make money, it must probably invest. Initially, when NIS was first conceptualized, what are some of the, and this may be good, I may be asking you to be a bit redundant here, but what are some of the ways that the NIS in those days made money and sustained itself?
I cannot answer definitively because I'm not aware of the portfolio. But as I said, in the early stages of the NIS, there were fewer contributors, and because of that, there was not such a heavy burden of payment of pensions and benefits. And my understanding is that some of the investment, or a large portion of the investment, might have been in government treasury bills, what they call gilted securities, that there was no danger that they would be collapsed. But the demand for money has grown exponentially over the years because people living longer, and those persons who are making contributions maybe 30 or 40 years ago are now receiving benefits. So the situation has changed, and what we are pointing out in APNU, what we're saying to the government, what we're saying to the NIS, is that you need to have a management, you need to have a style of administering the NIS which is more responsive to change. Things don't remain the same. So that is why you have to have periodic actuarial reviews, so that they look to see how investments are being made, how the scheme is being managed, so that changes could be implemented. And those changes apparently have not been implemented.
Finally, sir, I must ask you this. In your dealings with the ordinary man on the street, especially our senior citizens, are they worried?
They're scared. They're scared, and there are occasionally, scenes in some areas in which people have picketed NIS offices because payments are late. I'm aware of individuals who have not been able to get their full benefits because their employer did not submit the returns, or documents were lost or destroyed because everything was on paper. So there is, I would say, silent anger among some persons out there. there's no rebellion or there's no violence, but people have been and have felt deprived because of the inefficiency or the incompetence of the national insurance scheme. And I think things could be much better.
I know I did say final, but while our people are scared, somewhat scared, again, I'm not trying to be negative, but if this call by APNU should fall again on deaf ears, what's possibly the next move to get the NIS reformed?
As I said, we have to go through the National Assembly. That is the best means. We can call on the labor unions because most of the people involved are workers. I do believe that most of the contributors are ordinary working people, particularly in the public service. There is, I would say, a rather small component of persons who are in private enterprise or self-employed persons. Because of the nature of the scheme, many public servants are almost obliged to become members of this scheme. It's almost mandatory for them. So I would say that those are the people who are likely to be most affected. And I think they are really the ones who are most angry when things go wrong. So we have to work through the labor unions because the labor unions ought to represent the workers. And the largest unions, the Guyana Public Service Union, the Guyana Agriculture and General Workers Union, I think would account for the largest single block of members or contributors to the National Insurance Scheme. So we can turn to labor, the labor movement, for support in our efforts to reform the trade union movement. In fact, one of the directors of the board is a member of the Guyana, is the president of the Guyana Agriculture and General Workers Union, Mr. Kobal Chat. So labor has a foot there, foot in the door.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. Leader of the People's National Congress Reform and leader of the opposition, Brigadier the Honorable David Granger. This has been another edition of The Public Interest. We were discussing the problems of the National Insurance Scheme. I am Malika Ramsey. Thanks for watching.